Since some clever people in the news media discovered that Elon Musk had purchased a couple of oil rigs through a subsidiary company, these sorts of videos have been coming out pretty much non-stop. This one happens to be particularly good, as a matter of fact, from SpaceX Vision, who does a lot of really good work, but it's all been very speculative. A lot of guesswork in terms of how SpaceX is going to repurpose an oil platform as a launch facility for the most powerful rocket in human history and our best means of getting to the Red Planet. But all speculations aside, the platform does indeed exist, and SpaceX seems to be going to work on it very hard. These are photographs, a series of them, that I took myself on various visits to Boca Chica, and they've shown a varying degree of progress. Some of the later photographs showing a hell of a lot of cranes, indicating a lot of work being done on this platform before they tow it out to sea. This will be a floating semi-submersible platform, at least that's the way it's configured now, and we're assuming that it's going to be the same thing for future launches. Why do we assume this? Well, because it's been done before. You heard that right. The SpaceX Deimos, if indeed that is what this is by no means the first oil platform to be repurposed for rocket launches. This is called the Ocean Odyssey, a self-propelled, semi-submersible drilling platform designed to endure 110-foot North Atlantic waves, and it became a floating equatorial launch pad. In March of 1999, a Russian Zenit 3SL rocket fueled by kerosene and liquid oxygen put a satellite into geostationary orbit from this very platform. Now, although this Russian rocket was by no means the size of the Starship, it was pretty substantial. The Zenit was almost the size of the Falcon 9, and it sent some fairly substantial payloads to geostationary orbit, including some important telecommunications satellites. And it was quite successful, but unfortunately, the consortium that put the whole thing together was not terribly successful in cooperating, and it was led by a company that you won't believe, and we'll get into that in a moment. But there's something else to consider as far as the genius of this concept is concerned. And that is the simple fact that, as with all new technology, especially when it comes to rockets, there can be failures, and sometimes cataclysmic failures. But fortunately, this took place well offshore, and of course with a much smaller rocket, which made the explosion a lot less devastating. But still, even if this were to happen with the Starship well offshore, it would not be damaging or dangerous to people on land or any civilians in general. One of the reasons why this is an excellent idea, and a reason why I want to talk about not only what happened with Challenger, but also what almost happened with Challenger. Now, why do I want to talk about all of these subjects in one video? Well, you're going to find all of that out in just a moment. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, as I think you've been able to ascertain from my introductory comments, I'm going to be talking about Starship. And yes, I have finally gotten myself a haircut. Primarily, my main motivation was so I could fit this hat over my gigantic cranium. I like to believe that I have such an enormous head so that it can hold my vast storehouse of information. However, my children who inherited this genetic trait, they tend to think that it just means that I have a very thick skull that's well suited for bashing against walls. I'll leave that up to you as to who's right about all that. Anyway, as far as Starship is concerned, Elon recently rolled out, of course, almost all of you have probably seen it, this amazing rendering of Starship being fueled up, getting ready to go off of Deimos, off of this oil platform that has been purchased rather by one of his subsidiary companies, and is being repurposed as we speak as a launch platform. This, of course, is extremely exciting stuff, and it is, of course, extremely innovative. It opens up all sorts of advantages for Starship, which we're going to get into shortly, and in my opinion, this is the one way that Starship can be safely launched well off the coast. And we're going to be getting into that as well. And also, we're going to be talking about how this has all been done before, believe it or not, by a multinational consortium, including Norway, Russia, the Ukraine. Yes, there was a time when those two countries actually worked together, and they were led by Boeing. An amazingly innovative time for Boeing as well, and they pulled it off. They made the whole thing work for a considerable time period from the 90s into the beginning of this century, but they didn't make it practical, and it remains to be seen whether or not SpaceX is going to be able to make this practical. I think that they can, but at the same time, we also need to look at a cautionary tale involving that fateful day in 1986 when the Challenger flew for the last time. What the hell do these two incidents have to do with each other? We're gonna find out right now. Now, before I get started, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. The families and friends of the people who died on Challenger, many of them are still alive today, and for all I know, some of them may be watching this video. I am not going to show the actual Challenger flight, the explosion, or especially the reactions of Krista McAuliffe's parents to this tragedy, as the heartless news media did in a play-by-play description of their emotional reactions while they were scrutinized and examined on camera. The news media should be ashamed of themselves for what they did in the past. But let's get back to the actual incident. On the morning of January 28, 1986, 35 years ago now, the managers and engineers at Morton Thiokol, who were responsible for the Challenger solid rocket boosters, were up in arms. They knew about the dreaded O-ring problem that the rest of the world didn't find out about until much later, and the fact that they were incredibly vulnerable at low temperatures. They told NASA unanimously that Challenger could not launch under the current temperature conditions that morning, which were below 0 Celsius, without an explosion. They anticipated an explosion actually within a second or two of launch, when the shuttle was perhaps 100 to 150 meters of the tower. The Morton Thiokol engineers knew that the moment ignition happened, the solid rocket boosters' O-rings would give way, given the current temperatures, and that a gout of flame would emit from one or both of the solid rocket boosters, striking the main fuel tank and setting the whole thing up in a massive explosion, which is precisely what happened, but not as quickly as they expected, simply by a sheer dumb stroke of luck. To put things simply, the temperature of the solid rocket booster itself was so cold that at the moment that the O-ring gave, the fuel froze in its place, creating a temporary plug that actually held up for approximately 72 to 73 seconds, allowing the Challenger to gain substantial altitude before the disaster occurred. Had this not happened, had this plug not formed by a pure stroke of luck, the Challenger would have exploded just off the pad, creating an explosion that would have been similar to that of the N1 disaster in the Soviet Union, something that would have created far more damage on the ground. So as awful as the Challenger disaster was, a pure stroke of good fortune made it a lot less disastrous. But I am by no means trying to minimize the extent of this tragedy. 7 people died in front of a large percentage of America's school children, and under circumstances that need not have happened. NASA knew damn well what the dangers were, and the engineers at Morton Thiokol were absolutely certain, and unanimously so. Why the hell did NASA launch anyway? Well, we're gonna get to that in a moment. Now, launching the most powerful rocket in human history from a floating oil platform may sound like the most difficult engineering challenge in history, and it may very well be, even though this has been done before, not with anything similar to a rocket the size of the Starship. Nevertheless, the advantages to using a platform offshore are enormous. Not only is it separated from any potential civilian casualties by a huge distance, but also it has a lot more flexibility when it comes to the types of orbits that it can pursue. The limitation with ground-based launch facilities is the fact that they have to be located close to an ocean, so that if there is something that goes awry with the launch, the flight can be terminated safely out over the water where falling debris is not going to harm anybody, as you can see here. This means that any rocket launched from these locations has to follow a very specific trajectory and therefore a limited number of orbits, whereas a floating platform can launch to just about any direction, any trajectory, and to any orbit. Plus, you can, in theory, position the platform on the equator, making orbits even easier. And by the way, if you're asking yourself, hey, wait a minute, some of these launch facilities are nowhere near an ocean. What the hell is this guy talking about? Well, that's because the Russian Cosmodrome is located in a very isolated area of Kazakhstan, nowhere near any civilian locations, at least no major cities. And the Chinese, well, not the Chinese, but the People's Republic of China and their government doesn't seem to care whether or not debris falls on their own citizens. They're more concerned with secrecy. Anyway, back to sea launch. This was, as I said before, a consortium of companies from Russia, the Ukraine, Norway, and a 40% ownership by Boeing. But it was still a very innovative concept. They took an existing oil platform, cleared most of the superstructure off the top to make room for rocket launches, and repurposed it into a very effective launch platform that was used dozens of times to a great degree of success. There were a couple of failures, but nevertheless, they were able to position it on the equator, unlike just about any other type of launch facility in the world. But as you might imagine, operating costs were high to get the rockets, to get the fuel, to get everything out to this platform that was necessary in order to conduct launches, and eventually a collapsing economy during the Great Recession and other factors led to this company declaring Chapter 11 in 2009, and it hasn't launched a rocket since 2014. But even though this company fell on economic hard times, it accomplished a great deal. For example, if you enjoy satellite radio, there's a decent chance that the satellite transmitting that radio was launched by this system. And here's how they got rockets out to the platform in the first place: on a large container ship specifically designed for the purpose, and a platform would be lowered from the launch facility down to sea level, and then brought the rocket up to the level of the platform. Then the rocket was transported to the pad, hoisted to a vertical position, fueled up, and launched. Now, of course, that's putting it very simply, but here's a layout, or a sample layout, of how the Chinese intend to design a floating platform in the future to give you an idea of how SpaceX might do this. Now, of course, this involves assembling the rocket actually on the platform rather than going through the difficulty of hauling the entire rocket out in one piece on a ship and hoping that you don't lose it in the process. Will SpaceX pursue this route? It's difficult to say. And if you've seen any videos that claim to lay out exactly how SpaceX plans to do this with diagrams and all that, everything on social media is fake. No one, except perhaps a few engineers at SpaceX, know how they intend to repurpose this platform to launch something as gigantic as the Starship. We can surmise a few details. First of all, this platform is going to have to carry a lot more fuel than anything Sea Launch had in mind, or the People's Republic of China for that matter. This thing is going to carry more than double the fuel that the Space Shuttle did. That's not going to be sufficient with just a simple tank farm on the platform itself. There's probably going to have to be built-in fuel tanks in the structure itself, perhaps in the legs or something along those lines, but that's just guesswork. On top of that, they're probably going to be manufacturing a lot of their own fuel, especially liquid oxygen, and in the future, liquid methane, although to begin with, the methane will need to be shipped out via tanker. However, it must be remembered that shipping out over 1,000 tons of liquid methane for every launch to a platform is not going to be an inexpensive endeavor, to say nothing of shipping out the rocket as well. It's very important that SpaceX learn how to master the production of fuel on site, because this is what they're going to have to do on Mars, using water ice to produce liquid oxygen and using the Sabatier method, or Sabatier method, detailed in the description, to produce liquid methane. All of these things are going to have to be done before a Mars mission can even be considered, at least assuming that that Mars mission wants to come back someday. And these platforms, Deimos and Phobos, will be perfect laboratories for SpaceX to master this process. And so, in my opinion, this is undoubtedly the best way to launch Starship, with a complete freedom of trajectories, so you don't have to worry about flying over land and endangering the civilian population. Well offshore in case of any sorts of accidents. An added level of security, which SpaceX doesn't have right now, with people able to approach the prototype rockets within a distance of just a few hundred meters. I'm kind of surprised that nothing has happened up to this point, and other advantages as well, such as launching closer to the equator. So many pluses to this system. Granted, it will be expensive, but Elon intends to invest as much money as is necessary to make this work. And yet, for some reason, he still intends to launch the first Starship from Boca Chica, and this is really beginning to concern me if he is indeed serious about this. There are still too many unknowns with Super Heavy. We simply have no idea what 28 Raptors firing simultaneously are going to do, nearly double the thrust of the Saturn V. We do know that the decibel level, just the noise level at South Padre Island, is going to be deafening, perhaps sufficient to break glass on its own, even if there is no explosion, and so many other risks that I'm going to talk about now in conjunction with Challenger to bring this whole discussion full circle. So the question remains, why the hell did the decision makers at NASA override the opinions of all of the Morton Thiokol engineers, including the director of the SRB program, when they were saying with certainty that Challenger would not survive the launch, and yet they launched anyway, in spite of the fact that almost all of the school children of the United States were going to be watching this because of Krista McAuliffe? Why would any sane person make this decision? It's because NASA valued a schedule over safety. There had been so many delays with this launch and others, and NASA had made so many commitments to the US military that they could get military satellites into orbit more quickly and more cost effectively than any method they had used in the past, and now they were falling behind. And Challenger had been delayed so many times that NASA was more concerned about losing the military as a customer, which would have ended the entire shuttle program, than the safety of these 7 astronauts and indeed the people on the ground. So here's my point. If Starship can be safely launched from Phobos or Deimos well offshore and well away from any potential civilian casualties, then why not wait to launch the entire stacked vessel when Phobos and Deimos are ready, instead of trying to launch from Boca Chica, which is entirely too close to South Padre Island and Port Isabel, as I've said so many times? Why take the risk unless you are simply trying to pursue a date so you can get to Mars as quickly as possible? In my opinion, the safety of the public is far more important than trying to reach Mars by a specific date. If you have to wait another 2 years to get to Mars, then so be it, because a repeat of what happened with Challenger is a terrible alternative, especially with Starship, which carries more than double the fuel and double the destructive potential. So in the end, history can teach us 2 very important things about Deimos and Phobos. Firstly, that it is possible, that it can be done, that it's already been done, and was pretty much a practical solution. It was just the economic conditions that led to the failure of sea launch, and if they can do it, SpaceX certainly can, especially since Boeing was the leading partner on this deal. But by the same token, history should also teach us that taking risks in order to achieve specific dates and disregarding safety is a recipe for disaster.
Additionally, improved conveyor belts and lifts can now be
Now look,
constructed.
I want to make one thing
Materials
abundantly clear. I think I used a different wording that time, but in any event, whether it be perfectly clear or abundantly clear, I am 100% behind the Starship. I am also, I think as I've indicated in this video, 100% behind the concept of launching Starship from a refurbished oil platform. I think this is a brilliant idea. As we've seen in the video, it has been done before, not with a rocket nearly as huge as the Starship, but still with a substantial rocket, and it was done successfully over and over again, and it has lots and lots of advantages. And in my opinion, the biggest advantage is the fact that Starship can be launched from a significant distance from the shoreline, from any inhabited areas, because it is going to be by far the most powerful rocket ever launched. And I don't care how it's supposed to be better or just better engineered, less complicated, not having all these different companies working on it, etc., etc. It's going to be the most powerful rocket in history, by far, nearly twice the power of the Saturn V. That is not going to be an easy task. And yet, I still hear media sources talking about a July launch. Is anybody really serious about this? I certainly hope not. In 45 days, throwing together the most powerful rocket in human history and trying to get it off the ground without some sort of disaster happening is simply an unrealistic timetable. Trying to get it off the ground this year, in my opinion, is an unrealistic timetable. And I've said this over and over again, but I just feel that until a realistic timetable starts coming out, until we start hearing more realistic dates to launch this beast, that's when I'll stop talking about these cautionary tales. Because what happened with the Challenger, we must not fool ourselves. What happened with the Challenger could very well happen with the Starship. And what the designers of the SRBs expected to happen, that is the Challenger exploding 100 to 150 meters from clearing the tower, that's what should have happened. And could very well happen with Starship if every safety precaution is not taken. And NASA had a lot of safety precautions. And yet, as we have seen from this video and from history, these safety precautions were ignored in favor of speed and in favor of an unrealistic timetable that NASA had given to the US military and that they had to keep if they wanted to achieve their goals. And if Elon wants to get to Mars by the dates that he's talking about, that means Starship also has to take off on a certain timetable, regardless of whether it's ready or not. And so I think Starship being ready is what's the most important deciding factor here. And in my opinion, Starship will not be fully ready until Deimos is also ready. And these two should go hand in glove. The first launch of the fully fledged stacked Starship should take place from Deimos, well offshore and away from any potential civilian casualties, because I've described the potential dangers of a launch pad explosion or an airburst explosion, as with what happened with the N1 so many times. I'm just not going to keep repeating myself about it. But the fact of the matter is, this is such a good plan to launch it from an offshore platform that this is how it should be done. And in the meantime, Super Heavy should be put through its paces, hops, tests, fuel pressure, all sorts of things, just as Starship was. This should not be rushed to completion just to meet some date. That, the date that Mars and Earth are going to be in, the best position for a mission. If we are rushing to achieve a date rather than safety, what happened with the Challenger could happen with Starship, but even worse, given the fact that it carries more than double the fuel. If you like the way I put things, if you like my bluntness and the fact that I talk about these matters regardless of who I happen to piss off, and even though I am a fan of the Starship, I do try to be as honest as possible as well. If you enjoy all of that, it's all in the description as to how you can support me. Lots of different ways, lots of benefits for those who support me, but a like and a subscribe and I will be very happy as well. So until Deimos is ready to host the first fully fledged stacked Starship, the Super Heavy plus the Orbiter, until this offshore platform is ready to safely test the first orbital flight of this vessel, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.